true stories of forest hauntings. If you like the story, please consider liking it and subscribing to the channel. Also, it would be fun if you let me know what time it is when you watch it. Let's begin. It started with a late-night dive into the deep web. I was scrolling aimlessly, my curiosity leading me to places I probably shouldn't have been. It wasn't the first time I'd gone digging in the hidden corners of the internet, but this night felt different. I stumbled across a forum I hadn't seen before, one dedicated entirely to places you should never go. The posts ranged from urban legends to detailed accounts of people exploring cursed locations. Most of it sounded like fiction, but one thread caught my eye. It was titled, "The Forest That Sees You." The thread was filled with posts about a specific forest in an unnamed location, said to be haunted, or worse, alive. The users described it as a place where time didn't flow normally, where the trees whispered secrets, and where people went missing without a trace. One post, in particular, stood out. It included coordinates and a warning. If you go, don't take anything. Don't leave anything. And whatever you do, don't stray from the path. Against my better judgment, I couldn't let it go. The more I read, the more obsessed I became. The descriptions were vivid: trees with shifting bark, shadows that moved against the light, whispers that knew your name. It felt too detailed to be fake. One user claimed to have visited the forest and barely made it out, describing the experience as being swallowed by something ancient. I should have stopped there. I should have closed the tab and moved on. But I didn't. Instead, I found myself mapping the coordinates, trying to figure out if the forest was real. To my surprise, the location was only a few hours' drive from where I lived. I told myself it was nothing more than a story, a viral hoax meant to scare gullible people like me. But deep down, I wanted to see it for myself. The next morning, I packed a small bag with essentials, a flashlight, water, and my phone. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. How could I? I'm heading to a haunted forest I found on the deep web. Wasn't exactly something you could say without sounding insane. As I drove toward the coordinates, the landscape grew increasingly desolate. The road narrowed, the trees thickened, and the cell signal on my phone disappeared entirely. By the time I reached the edge of the forest, I felt a strange sense of unease. The air was heavy, almost stifling, and the sunlight seemed dimmer, as if the trees were swallowing it. The forest itself looked unremarkable at first glance. Tall pines stretched toward the sky, their branches weaving a canopy that blocked out most of the light. The ground was covered in a thick layer of fallen leaves, their colors muted and dull. But as I stepped out of the car and approached the tree line, I felt the distinct sensation of being watched. I told myself it was nothing, just nerves. I took a deep breath, adjusted my backpack, and stepped into the woods. The moment I crossed the threshold into the forest, everything changed. It wasn't something I could put my finger on at first. It was subtle, like walking into a room where someone had been arguing moments before. The air felt heavier, thicker, almost as if the forest was alive and aware of my presence. I pushed forward, my boots crunching softly against the layer of leaves and twigs underfoot. The forest was eerily quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, no distant hum of insects, just silence. It wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet you'd expect in nature. It was oppressive, like the trees themselves were holding their breath. I glanced back toward the direction I'd come from, just to reassure myself the car was still there, but the tree line was already obscured. The dense foliage seemed to close in behind me, swallowing the path entirely. My heart raced as I realized how easy it would be to get lost. It was then I noticed the first strange detail. The trees closest to me seemed normal at a glance, but the bark was marked with faint, almost imperceptible lines, patterns that looked unnatural. I ran my fingers across one, and it felt smooth, too smooth, as if it had been deliberately carved. The lines didn't form words or symbols, at least not ones I recognized, but there was a pattern to them. I pulled out my phone to take a photo, but the screen refused to turn on. I checked the battery, but it was full when I left the car. Now it was dead. I swallowed hard, pushing down the growing sense of unease, and kept moving. The deeper I went, the stranger the forest became. The trees stood unnaturally straight, their branches intertwining to form a canopy so dense that only faint beams of light filtered through. The air felt colder, and the smell of damp earth was replaced by something metallic, sharp, and out of place. And then came the shadows. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, the way the light shifted through the trees. But the more I walked, the more I noticed them darting just at the edge of my vision. Quick, fleeting movements that were gone the moment I turned my head. I stopped in my tracks, listening. My breath was shallow, and my pulse hammered in my ears. The silence was absolute, yet I could swear I felt something moving around me. My mind raced with rational explanations. Maybe it was animals, a trick of the light, or just nerfs. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. A sudden breeze swept through the forest, stirring the leaves on the ground. It shouldn't have been unsettling, but it was. The wind carried a faint sound, a whisper so quiet it could have been mistaken for the rustling of branches. I froze, straining to hear. The whisper wasn't coming from one place. It seemed to surround me, growing louder the longer I stood there. I quickened my pace, hoping to shake the unease that clung to me. But the whispers followed, ebbing and flowing as if they were trying to form words. I told myself I was imagining things. Forests had a way of playing tricks on people, especially when they were alone. But then I saw it. Just ahead, a tree stood out among the others. Its bark was darker, its trunk twisted unnaturally, as if it had been writhing in pain for centuries. The base of the tree was surrounded by a ring of mushrooms, small, pale, and glowing faintly. I hesitated, my instinct screaming at me to turn back, but curiosity pushed me forward. The lines on the bark were more intricate here, almost like runes or glyphs, carved deep into the wood. I reached out to touch them, but as my fingers brushed the surface, the whispers stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was suffocating. It felt as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting. And then, just as suddenly, the whispers returned, louder this time, more distinct. They weren't random sounds anymore. They were voices. My name was the first thing I heard. The whispers repeated my name over and over, soft at first but growing louder, more insistent. My pulse quickened as I turned in a slow circle, trying to pinpoint their source. But they weren't coming from one place. They seemed to echo from every direction. The trees around me stood unnaturally still, as if they were listening too. That's when I noticed it, a faint trail leading deeper into the forest. The ground was bare, the leaves and debris swept away, forming a narrow, deliberate path. It wasn't natural. The edges were too precise, too clean, as though someone or something had carved it out with purpose. The trees lining the path were different too. Their bark was darker, rougher, and each one was etched with intricate markings. They resembled the lines I'd seen before, but were more detailed, forming symbols that seemed almost ancient. The designs pulsed faintly, like they were alive, their glow barely visible in the dim light. I hesitated at the entrance of the path, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But a strange compulsion pushed me forward. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was something deeper, like the forest itself was pulling me in. As I stepped onto the path, the whispers faded, replaced by an eerie silence. The air grew colder, and the metallic scent that had lingered earlier became stronger, sharper. I clutched the flashlight in my hand, even though I didn't need it yet. The faint light filtering through the canopy seemed to dim with every step I took, as if the forest was closing in around me. The deeper I ventured, the stranger the markings became. The symbols carved into the trees were more intricate, more deliberate. Some resembled spirals, others jagged lines that branched off like veins. They weren't random. There was a pattern to them, but I couldn't make sense of it. I pulled out a small notebook from my backpack and started sketching the symbols as best I could, hoping they might make sense later. But as I drew, I noticed something odd. The lines seemed to shift on the page, twisting and rearranging themselves. I blinked, thinking it was a trick of the light, but it wasn't. The symbols were moving. I dropped the notebook, my heart pounding. The path began to change as well. The trees grew taller, their branches intertwining overhead to form an almost tunnel-like canopy. The ground beneath my feet felt softer, spongier, as though it were alive. Shadows danced at the edges of my vision, but every time I turned my head, there was nothing there. Then I heard it, a faint humming sound, rhythmic and low, coming from somewhere ahead. It wasn't mechanical, but it wasn't natural either. It sounded like chanting, though I couldn't make out any words. My legs felt heavy, my steps slower and more deliberate. It was as if the forest was resisting me now, testing my resolve. The humming grew louder, resonating in my chest like a second heartbeat. I reached a bend in the path and froze. Ahead of me, the trees formed an archway, their trunks bending and twisting together unnaturally. The symbols on the bark glowed brighter here, their light pulsating in time with a hum. I could feel the air vibrating, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. As I stepped closer, the archway seemed to shift, its edges rippling like a mirage. It felt wrong, impossibly wrong, but I couldn't stop myself. The pull was stronger now, almost physical, drawing me forward. When I passed through the archway, the temperature dropped sharply. My breath came out in visible puffs, and my skin prickled with goosebumps. The path on the other side was narrower, the trees closer together, their bark almost black. The markings were everywhere now, not just on the trees, but on the ground and even the rocks scattered along the path. I bent down to examine one of the rocks, my flashlight casting long shadows as I turned it over. It was smooth, polished, and etched with a symbol I hadn't seen before, a spiral surrounded by jagged lines. As I studied it, the humming grew louder, almost deafening. The whispers returned, mingling with a hum in a chaotic symphony of sound. They weren't just saying my name anymore. They were speaking words, fragments of sentences that I couldn't fully understand. Follow the path. It sees you. Don't stop. I dropped the rock and stood, my head spinning. The forest felt alive now, its presence pressing against me from all sides. The trees seemed to lean closer, their branches creaking softly, though there was no wind. I quickened my pace, desperate to reach the end of the path, wherever it might lead. The air grew heavier with every step, the hum and whispers vibrating through my body. The symbols on the trees glowed brighter, their light casting strange, shifting patterns on the ground. Then, just as abruptly as it had started, the path ended. I found myself standing in a small clearing, surrounded by trees that twisted and spiraled upward like frozen flames. In the center of the clearing was a circle of stones, arranged with precision too perfect to be natural. The ground within the circle was bare, the dirt smooth and undisturbed, as though it had been swept clean. The humming stopped, and the silence that followed was suffocating. I stepped closer, my heart pounding, and noticed that the stones were etched with the same symbols I'd seen throughout the forest. They glowed faintly, their light pulsing like a heartbeat. I knelt beside one of the stones, running my fingers over its surface. The whispers returned, louder and more distinct. You're here. It's watching. You can't leave. I scrambled back, my flashlight flickering as the shadows around me began to shift. The clearing felt alive, the air thick with tension. I didn't know what I'd stumbled into, but I knew one thing for certain. This forest wasn't just haunted. It was alive. The clearing was silent, but it wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that presses against your ears, amplifying the sound of your own heartbeat. I stood there, frozen, staring at the circle of stones. The glow of the symbols on their surfaces pulsed faintly, but their rhythm didn't feel random. It felt deliberate, like a message waiting to be deciphered. Then the voices started again. At first, they were faint, indistinct whispers, blending into the forest's oppressive stillness. But as I strained to listen, the words became clearer, sharper, as though they were being spoken directly into my ears. You shouldn't have come. It's too late. Alex. Hearing my name made my blood run cold. I hadn't told anyone where I was going. The voices shouldn't have known who I was. I turned in a slow circle, my flashlight casting long, jagged shadows across the trees. The forest felt alive now, the air charged with a tension I couldn't describe. Who's there? I called out, my voice shaky and uncertain. The only response was the sound of the wind, or at least that's what I thought it was at first. But the wind carried voices, faint and fragmented, overlapping in a cacophony of sound. Keep moving. It sees you. Don't stop. I felt a chill crawl up my spine as I realized the voices weren't coming from one place. They were coming from everywhere. The trees, the ground, the very air seemed to be speaking to me. I clutched my flashlight tighter, my hands trembling, and backed away from the circle of stones. But the moment I stepped out of the clearing, the forest seemed to shift. The path I had come from was gone, replaced by a tangle of trees that looked unfamiliar. I turned in another direction, only to find more of the same. Panic began to set in. The forest wasn't just alive, it was changing, rearranging itself to keep me trapped. The voices grew louder, their tones shifting from warning to something more sinister. They overlapped and intertwined, forming sentences that didn't make sense but carried a sense of urgency. It's awake. The path isn't yours. Run. But there was nowhere to run. Every direction I turned, the trees loomed closer, their gnarled branches forming barriers that seemed to pulse with faint light. The whispers continued, growing louder, until they were almost deafening. And then, just as suddenly, they stopped. The silence was suffocating. I could hear my own breath, shallow and uneven, and the pounding of my heart in my chest. The forest felt heavier now, as if it were closing in around me. The glow from the symbols on the trees seemed brighter, their light casting strange patterns on the ground that twisted and shifted like living things. I took a hesitant step forward, trying to find some semblance of a path, when I heard it, a voice clear and distinct, calling my name. Alex. It wasn't a whisper this time. It was louder, closer, and disturbingly familiar. It sounded like me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Who's there? I called out again, my voice trembling. The forest didn't answer, but the voice called my name again, this time from a different direction. I spun around, the flashlight beam shaking in my hand. The shadows at the edge of the light seemed to ripple and shift, as though something was just out of view. Alex. This time, it was a chorus of voices, all speaking my name in perfect unison. Some were soft, almost pleading, while others were harsh and demanding. I felt my legs weaken, my body trembling as the voices seemed to come from every direction at once. I stumbled forward, desperate to escape the oppressive sound, but the forest felt endless. The trees pressed closer, their branches twisting like outstretched hands. The symbols on their bark pulsed faster, their light flickering like the dying glow of embers. The voices began to form sentences, fragments of thoughts that filled my mind with dread. You belong to it now. It's watching you. Don't look away. I didn't know what they meant, but the weight of their words settled over me like a shroud. The forest wasn't just alive, it was sentient, aware of my every move, and it wanted me to know I couldn't leave. The wind picked up suddenly, carrying with it a sound that sent chills down my spine. It was faint at first, like the rustling of leaves, but it grew louder, more distinct. It was laughter. Low, guttural laughter that echoed through the trees, mocking and cruel. I broke into a run, my feet pounding against the uneven ground as I tried to find a way out. The laughter followed me, mingling with the whispers and voices, forming a nightmarish symphony that filled the air. The forest seemed to twist and shift around me, the trees moving subtly, almost imperceptibly, to block my path. I tripped over an exposed root, falling hard onto the ground, and the flashlight slipped from my hand, rolling away. I scrambled to retrieve it, but when I shone the beam ahead, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure stood in the distance, just at the edge of the light. It was humanoid but wrong, its limbs too long, and its movements too jerky. Its face was obscured by shadows, but its hollow eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the light like an animal's. The figure didn't move at first. It just stood there, watching me, its head tilting slightly as if studying me. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent, their words blending into a single coherent sentence. It's here. The figure took a step forward, its movements unnatural, almost mechanical. I scrambled to my feet, my heart racing as I stumbled backward. The figure stopped, tilting its head again, and then turned and melted into the shadows. But the feeling of being watched didn't leave. It only grew stronger. I clutched the flashlight tightly, scanning the trees around me. The shadows seemed to move on their own now, darting just beyond the edges of the light. The voices grew louder, overlapping and chaotic, filling my mind with a sense of impending doom. And then, through the cacophony, I heard one final whisper. You can't leave. I stumbled forward, my breath ragged, my legs heavy with exhaustion. The voices seemed to retreat into the background, but their presence lingered like a faint hum, vibrating through my chest. The oppressive air of the forest grew thicker, the metallic scent sharp enough to sting my nose. Every step felt heavier than the last, as though the forest itself was trying to anchor me in place. And then I saw it, the clearing. The trees gave way to an open space bathed in an eerie, bluish light that didn't seem to have a source. The air here was colder, the silence deeper, like the forest was holding its breath. At the center of the clearing was what could only be described as a ritual site, a perfect circle of stones, each one etched with intricate symbols that glowed faintly. The stones were arranged in a deliberate pattern, their surfaces smooth and polished. In the center of the circle lay a flat, circular slab of stone, its surface black and glossy, reflecting the faint light like a pool of water. The symbols on the stones pulsed rhythmically, like a heartbeat, and as I stepped closer, I could feel the energy radiating from them. I stopped at the edge of the circle, hesitant to step inside. My instinct screamed at me to turn back, but something about the sight drew me in. It felt ancient, powerful, like it had been here long before the forest had grown around it. The whispers returned, louder now, clearer. "Come closer. You're here. It's waiting." I took a cautious step toward the circle, my flashlight flickering as though reacting to the energy in the air. The shadows around the clearing shifted, twisting unnaturally, but they never crossed the circle's boundary. It was as if the site was both a beacon and a barrier, a place of power that even the forest's entities dared not enter. I knelt beside one of the stones, running my fingers over the glowing symbols etched into its surface. The markings felt warm to the touch, almost alive, and as I traced them, the whispers grew louder. They weren't random anymore. They were words, fragments of sentences that sent chills down my spine. "This is the heart. It feeds here. You are the offering." I recoiled, stumbling backward as the implications of the words sank in. My flashlight beam wavered, casting erratic shadows across the clearing. For a moment, I thought I saw movement at the edge of the light, a flicker of something tall and humanoid, but when I turned to look, it was gone. I forced myself to breathe, to focus. I needed to figure out what this place was and how to get out of the forest. My mind raced as I scanned the clearing, looking for anything that could give me answers. That's when I noticed the carvings on the central slab. The symbols on the slab were different from the ones on the stones. They were more intricate, more deliberate, and they glowed brighter. The arrangement seemed purposeful, almost like a map or a set of instructions. I knelt beside the slab, studying the carvings, and realized that some of the symbols matched the ones I had seen earlier on the trees and rocks. My fingers trembled as I traced the lines, trying to make sense of them. The symbols seemed to shift under my touch, rearranging themselves into patterns I couldn't fully comprehend. The whispers grew louder, overlapping in a chaotic symphony that filled my mind with fragments of meaning. "The path is sealed. It feeds on fear. The heart beats for you." The whispers stopped suddenly, replaced by a low, rhythmic hum that resonated through the clearing. The ground beneath me seemed to vibrate, the stones pulsing with light. I stumbled back, my flashlight flickering violently, and the shadows at the edge of the clearing began to shift. From the darkness, figures emerged. They weren't fully formed, their shapes twisting and flickering like static. Some were tall and humanoid, their limbs unnaturally long, while others were small and hunched, their forms almost insect-like. Their hollow eyes glowed faintly, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. The figures moved slowly, circling the edge of the clearing but never crossing the boundary. It was as if the ritual side held them at bay, but I could feel their hunger, their need. The whispers returned, softer this time, almost pleading. "Stay. Complete it. You belong here." I backed away from the slab, my heart pounding. The figures didn't follow, but their presence was overwhelming, their hollow eyes unblinking. The shadows around them twisted and writhed, reaching toward the circle as though trying to drag me out. My flashlight flickered and died, plunging the clearing into near darkness. The only light came from the glowing symbols on the stones and slab, casting an eerie blue glow that made the shadows seem even darker. I fumbled for my spare batteries, my hands trembling, but the whispers grew louder, drowning out my thoughts. The shadows at the edge of the clearing shifted violently, the figures pressing closer, their forms becoming more defined. And then I heard it, a voice clear and distinct, rising above the cacophony of whispers. "You must finish it." The voice didn't come from the shadows. It came from the slab. I turned slowly, my pulse hammering in my ears, and saw something I hadn't noticed before. In the center of the slab was a small indentation, perfectly round, as if it were meant to hold something. The voice spoke again, louder this time. "Complete the offering." I didn't know what it meant, but the urgency in the voice was undeniable. The shadows at the edge of the clearing grew bolder, their movements more erratic. The figures stepped closer, their hollow eyes fixed on me. Desperate, I reached into my bag, searching for anything that might fit into the indentation. My fingers closed around a small, smooth stone I had picked up earlier, the one etched with a spiral symbol. I hesitated, my mind racing. Was this what the forest wanted? What would happen if I placed the stone on the slab? The voice spoke again, softer now. "It's the only way." With a deep breath, I placed the stone in the indentation. The ground beneath me trembled, and the symbols on the slab and stones flared brightly. The figures at the edge of the clearing let out a collective hiss, retreating into the shadows as the light grew blinding. And then, everything went still. The light faded, the shadows disappeared, and the clearing was silent once more. The press of weight in the air lifted slightly, but I knew it wasn't over. The forest had given me a reprieve, but the whispers still lingered faintly in the back of my mind. I didn't know what I had done, but I knew one thing for certain: the forest wasn't finished with me yet. The clearing was quiet now, the oppressive energy that had pressed down on me moments ago dissipating like a heavy fog. I stood there, staring at the faintly glowing symbols on the stones, my mind racing with questions. What had I just done? What had the forest demanded of me? The whispers had receded into silence, but the weight of their presence still lingered, like an echo reverberating in my chest. I picked up the flashlight, its flickering beam weak but functional, and turned to leave the clearing. As I stepped back onto the forest floor, I realized the ground felt different, softer, as though the earth beneath my feet had shifted. The forest was no longer the same. The trees stood taller, their branches intertwining overhead to form a dense, living canopy. The air was colder, heavier, and metallic scent had returned, sharper than before. The path I had taken to reach the clearing was gone, replaced by a labyrinth of gnarled roots and twisted trunks. I tried to calm my breathing, to focus on retracing my steps, but the forest itself seemed intent on keeping me disoriented. Every direction I turned, the scenery appeared to change, trees shifting subtly, shadows deepening in unnatural ways. And then the whispers returned. They were faint at first, indistinct murmurs carried on a wind, but they grew louder with every step I took. They no longer called my name or gave fragmented warnings. Instead, they spoke in unison, their tone almost mournful. It feeds. It grows. It is alive. I froze, my heart racing as the realization hit me. The forest wasn't just haunted or cursed. It was alive, a sentient entity that thrived on the energy of those who entered. The symbols, the whispers, the shadows, they weren't separate phenomena. They were part of the forest itself, extensions of its will. The trees around me seemed to move subtly, their trunks shifting as though they were breathing. I pressed forward, my footsteps slow and deliberate, scanning the area for anything familiar. But every turn led to more of the same: towering trees, glowing symbols, and the faint sense of being watched. I tried to shake the feeling, but it grew stronger with every passing moment. The forest wasn't just alive, it was aware. I stopped abruptly, shining my flashlight ahead, and caught a glimpse of something that sent chills down my spine. Carved into the bark of a nearby tree was a message, scrawled hastily and unevenly, as though it had been scratched into the wood with trembling hands. "Leave while you can." The words were crude, the edges of the carving jagged, but their meaning was unmistakable. Whoever had left this message had been here before me, and they hadn't left unscathed. I scanned the surrounding trees, and more messages began to emerge, their carved letters faint but legible. "IT knows you. Don't look back. It's too late." My pulse quickened as I realized the carvings weren't random. They formed a trail, guiding me deeper into the forest. Part of me wanted to ignore them, to turn around and find my own way out, but something about the messages felt important. They weren't warnings, they were instructions. I followed the trail of carvings, the flashlight beam flickering with every step. The forest grew darker, the air colder, and the whispers louder, but I pressed on. The carvings led me to a tree unlike any I had seen before. Its trunk was massive, its bark blackened and twisted, and its branches stretched high into the canopy, disappearing into the shadows. Symbols covered its surface, glowing faintly, but these were different from the ones I'd seen before. They were older, more intricate, and radiated an energy that made my skin crawl. At the base of the tree was a small hollow, its interior lined with the same glowing symbols. Inside the hollow lay a collection of objects, trinkets, photographs, pieces of jewelry, all arranged in a neat, deliberate pattern. I knelt beside the hollow, studying the objects. Each one seemed personal, intimate, like they had belonged to someone who had come before me. The whispers shifted, their tone softer now, almost mournful. They came, they gave, they stayed. My breath hitched as the meaning became clear. These were offerings, tokens left by those who had tried to appease the forest. Some were simple, like a locket or a coin, while others were more elaborate. A hand-carved figurine, a folded letter, even a pair of glasses. I reached for one of the objects, a small worn photograph, but as my fingers brushed it, the whispers surged. Don't. I recoiled, my heart pounding, and the forest seemed to react to my hesitation. The ground trembled faintly, the shadows shifting more violently. The carvings on the nearby trees glowed brighter, their symbols pulsing in time with the whispers. The forest was growing impatient. I stood, clutching the flashlight tightly, and scanned the area for a way out. But the forest had other plans. The shadows coalesced into shapes, humanoid figures with glowing, hollow eyes that stepped forward from the darkness. They moved slowly, deliberately, their forms flickering like static. Some were tall and thin, their limbs elongated unnaturally, while others were hunched and malformed. They didn't speak, but their presence was overwhelming, suffocating. The whispers grew louder, their words blending into a single, coherent command. Give. I realized then what the forest wanted. It didn't just feed on fear or energy. It demanded a piece of you, something deeply personal, something that tied you to the world outside its boundaries. I reached into my backpack, searching for anything that might satisfy the forest. My fingers closed around a small, worn notebook, the one I had used to sketch the symbols earlier. It wasn't much, but it held my thoughts, my observations, pieces of me that I had poured into its pages. I placed the notebook into the hollow at the base of the tree, my hands trembling. The shadows stopped moving, the figures retreating slightly, their hollow eyes still fixed on me. The whispers softened, their tone almost approving. It is enough. The ground beneath me shifted, the air growing warmer, lighter. The forest seemed to exhale, its oppressive weight lifting slightly. The figures melted back into the shadows, and the glowing symbols on the trees dimmed. I turned and began to walk, the path ahead of me clearer now. The trees no longer loomed as close, their branches parting to reveal faint glimpses of light. The whispers faded into the background, growing fainter with every step. I didn't know if I was free, but the forest was letting me go for now. As I walked deeper into the forest, the oppressive silence returned. The air was heavy and cold, the metallic scent lingering faintly as though it had soaked into the trees themselves. My flashlight flickered again, casting erratic beams of light that seemed to make the shadows stretch unnaturally. The path ahead seemed clearer, but the weight of the forest was still palpable. Every step felt deliberate, as if the forest were guiding me somewhere. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, not by one pair of eyes, but by countless unseen entities hidden in the shadows. And then I saw them. They emerged slowly, at the edges of my vision, flickering like static against the backdrop of the trees. The first was tall and thin, its limbs elongated and moving with a strange, jerky grace. Its body seemed to be made of shadows and bark, its surface shifting and twisting as though it was barely holding itself together. Behind it, more figures appeared, some humanoid, others grotesque and hunched, their forms less defined but no less unsettling. Their eyes glowed faintly, a sickly yellow light that pierced the darkness and locked onto me. I stopped in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. My flashlight's beam wavered as I slowly scanned the area. The entities didn't move closer, but their presence was overwhelming. The air around them shimmered faintly, as if they carried an energy that distorted reality itself. The whispers returned, but they were different now, deeper, resonating in my chest like a low hum. They weren't just speaking words. They were conveying feelings, emotions that seeped into my mind. Fear, curiosity, hunger. One of the taller figures stepped closer, its movements fluid and deliberate. Its hollow eyes glowed brighter, and I could see its form more clearly. Its body was covered in jagged ridges, its surface pulsating faintly as though it were alive. It tilted its head, studying me, and I felt a wave of unease wash over me. The whispers grew louder, overlapping in a chaotic symphony. They see you. You are part of it now. It needs more. I stumbled back, my flashlight beam catching on the face of another entity. This one was smaller, its form hunched and gnarled, with limbs that ended in sharp, root-like protrusions. It tilted its head too, mirroring the taller figure, as though they were communicating silently. The whispers shifted, their tone almost inquisitive. Who are you? What will you give? It watches. The entities didn't move closer, but the space between us felt alive, charged with an energy I couldn't comprehend. The forest itself seemed to pulse in rhythm with their presence. the trees leaning slightly as if bowing to them. I tried to move, to step away from the figures, but my legs felt heavy, rooted to the spot. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. These weren't just spirits or ghosts. They were something more, something tied intrinsically to the forest. One of the figures raised a hand, its long skeletal fingers curling slightly as though beckoning me forward. The whispers grew louder, their tone more insistent. Closer. It's waiting. You must see. I shook my head, my heart pounding. What do you want from me? I whispered, my voice trembling. The figures didn't answer. Instead, they began to move, circling me slowly, their movements unnervingly synchronized. The glow from their eyes grew brighter, casting faint beams of light that danced across the trees. The whispers shifted again, forming a single sentence that resonated in my mind. The forest must grow. I didn't understand what it meant, but the weight of the words pressed down on me, suffocating and relentless. The entities stopped circling, their glowing eyes fixed on me. One of them stepped closer, its movement slow and deliberate. It extended a hand toward me, its fingers impossibly long and thin, and I felt a wave of cold wash over me. The whispers intensified, their voices blending into a deafening roar. Give, give, give. Desperate, I reached into my backpack, searching for something, anything to offer. My hands closed around a small pendant, a simple keepsake I had carried for years. It wasn't valuable, but it was deeply personal, a gift from someone long gone. I held it out, my hand shaking, and the entity paused. Its glowing eyes flickered, and the whispers softened, their tone almost approving. Yes. The entity took the pendant, its fingers brushing mine, and I felt an icy jolt that made my skin crawl. It stepped back, holding the pendant as though examining it, and the other figures stopped moving. The forest seemed to exhale, the oppressive weight lifting slightly. The entities began to retreat, their forms flickering and dissolving into the shadows. The whispers faded, replaced by a faint hum that resonated through the trees. I stood there, my legs trembling, as the forest grew quiet once more. The glow from the symbols on the trees dimmed, and the path ahead of me became clearer. The largest figure lingered for a moment longer, its hollow eyes meeting mine. It tilted its head one last time before stepping back into the darkness, disappearing completely. I didn't wait to see if they would return. I turned and began walking, my pace quickening as the forest seemed to open up around me. The air was still heavy, the metallic scent faint but present, but the whispers were gone. The entities hadn't harmed me, but they had taken something from me, something I could never get back. I didn't know if it was enough to satisfy the forest, but I knew one thing for certain. I had to get out before it changed its mind. The forest was quieter now, the whispers reduced to faint murmurs that seemed to hover just beyond my hearing. But the air was still heavy, charged with an energy that prickled at my skin. I could feel the weight of the entity's presence lingering, even though they were no longer visible. The path ahead seemed clearer, but I knew better than to trust the forest. As I moved forward, the ground beneath me shifted subtly, the earth softer and more pliable than before. The trees around me were marked with glowing symbols, their faint light pulsating in a steady rhythm. It was as if the forest was guiding me, pushing me towards something I couldn't yet see. I walked cautiously, my flashlight casting long jagged shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. Every now and then, I would catch glimpses of movement at the edges of the light, flickers of shadowy figures watching me from the trees. They didn't approach, but their presence was suffocating, a constant reminder that I was not alone. The whispers began to grow louder again, their tone shifting from inquisitive to insistent. They no longer called my name or spoke fragmented sentences. Instead, they repeated one word over and over. Give, give, give. The path began to narrow, the trees closing in around me, their branches intertwining overhead to form an almost tunnel-like canopy. The glow from the symbols grew brighter, illuminating the way forward. I felt a sense of inevitability, as though the forest itself was herding me toward a specific destination. After what felt like hours, the path opened into another clearing. This one was different from the first. It was larger, the ground covered in a fine layer of ash that seemed to shimmer faintly in the dim light. At the center of the clearing was a stone pedestal, its surface etched with the same intricate symbols I had seen throughout the forest. The whispers swelled, their voices merging into a single, commanding tone. Give to the heart. I hesitated at the edge of the clearing, my instinct screaming at me to turn back. But the forest had made it clear I couldn't leave until I gave it what it wanted. I stepped into the clearing, the ash crunching softly beneath my boots. The air was colder here, the metallic scent sharp and suffocating. As I approached the pedestal, I noticed that the symbols on its surface were more intricate than any I had seen before. They seemed to shift and ripple, their glow pulsating like a heartbeat. The whispers grew louder as I reached the pedestal, their tone urgent and demanding. Give, give, give. I placed my flashlight on the ground, its beam casting strange, flickering shadows across the clearing, and opened my backpack. My hands trembled as I searched for something to offer. The forest had already taken the pendant, but I could feel its hunger. It wanted more. I pulled out my notebook, the one filled with sketches of the symbols I had encountered. It wasn't just a collection of drawings, it was a record of my journey, a piece of myself captured on paper. I hesitated, the weight of the decision pressing down on me. The whispers swirled around me, their voices almost pleading now. The heart must feed. It grows. It is alive. With a deep breath, I placed the notebook on the pedestal. The moment it touched the stone, the symbols flared brightly, their light blinding. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, and the ground beneath me trembled. The ash on the ground began to shift, swirling upward in a chaotic spiral that enveloped the notebook. The light from the symbols pulsed violently, casting jagged beams across the clearing. I stumbled back, shielding my eyes as the whispers reached their peak. And then, just as suddenly, everything went still. The ash settled, the light dimmed, and the whispers faded into silence. The notebook was gone, its pages consumed by the pedestal. The symbols on the stone glowed faintly, their light steady and calm, as though the forest had been satisfied for now. I stood there, my breath ragged, my body trembling. The clearing was quiet again, but the air was still heavy, charged with the forest's energy. I didn't know what I had just done, but I felt a strange sense of relief, as though a weight had been lifted. The path behind me reappeared, its edges lined with faintly glowing symbols. It was as if the forest was showing me the way out, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me, waiting for my next move. I picked up my flashlight and began to walk, my steps slow and deliberate. The path was clearer now, the trees less oppressive, their branches no longer twisting unnaturally. But the forest's presence was still there, a faint hum that vibrated through the air. As I moved further away from the clearing, the whispers returned, softer this time, their tone almost wistful. It is done. The heart beats. You may leave. I didn't dare respond. I kept walking, my eyes fixed on the path ahead, determined not to look back. The forest seemed to open up as I neared its edge, the trees growing thinner and the air lighter. The metallic scent faded, replaced by the familiar smell of damp earth and leaves. I could see a faint glow in the distance, the soft golden light of the setting sun filtering through the trees. When I finally stepped out of the forest, I collapsed to my knees, the weight of the experience crashing down on me. My body was exhausted, my mind racing with questions that I couldn't begin to answer. As I sat there, catching my breath, I glanced back at the forest. The trees stood tall and silent, their shadows stretching toward me as though reaching for one last piece of me. The whispers were gone, but I knew they weren't far. The forest had let me go, but it hadn't forgotten me. I stood at the forest's edge, staring at the expanse of trees behind me. The whispers were gone, but the weight of the forest's presence lingered, pressing against my mind like a distant echo. The faint golden light of the setting sun offered a fragile sense of security, but I knew better than to trust it. The forest had let me go for now, but I wasn't free yet. I took a shaky step forward, the soft crunch of leaves beneath my boots grounding me momentarily. My legs felt weak, my body trembling from exhaustion and fear. I forced myself to keep moving, every step pulling me further away from the forest's shadow. But the feeling of being watched didn't leave. The air around me was lighter now, the metallic scent replaced by the familiar smell of damp earth and pine. I could hear birds in the distance, their calls sharp and clear, as though the natural world was waking up around me. It should have been comforting, but it wasn't. Every sound felt deliberate, as though it carried a hidden message. I glanced over my shoulder, unable to stop myself. The forest loomed behind me, its trees standing unnaturally still. The shadows between the trunks seemed to ripple faintly, as though something was watching me from the darkness. My pulse quickened as I turned away, my pace quickening. I kept walking, my steps hurried and uneven. The landscape grew more familiar as I moved further from the forest. Open fields, scattered boulders, and the faint outline of the road where I had parked my car. Relief began to bubble up in my chest, but it was tempered by a gnawing sense of unease. The whispers were gone, but the forest's energy still clung to me, a faint hum that I couldn't shake. I reached for my phone, hoping to check the time or call someone, but it was still dead, the screen dark and unresponsive. The road came into view, and for the first time in hours, I felt a flicker of hope. My car was exactly where I had left it, parked on the gravel shoulder at the edge of the woods. I broke into a run, my boots pounding against the ground as I sprinted toward the car. My breath came in ragged gasps, and my heart raced, not just from exertion, but from the overwhelming need to put as much distance as possible between myself and the forest. I reached the car and yanked the door open, throwing my backpack onto the passenger seat before collapsing into the driver's seat. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, the metal jangling loudly into silence. The engine roared to life, and I slammed the door shut, locking it instinctively. For a moment, I just sat there, gripping the steering wheel tightly, my breath shallow and uneven. I glanced at the rearview mirror, my eyes darting to the forest edge. It looked quiet, undisturbed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, hiding just beyond the trees. The shadows seemed darker, deeper, as though they were alive. The faint hum I had felt earlier grew stronger, vibrating through the car like static. My hands trembled as I shifted into gear, the tires crunching against the gravel as I pulled onto the road. I drove slowly at first, my eyes flicking between the road ahead and the forest in the rearview mirror. The shadows didn't move, but the oppressive feeling of being watched didn't fade. As the road stretched ahead, the forest began to fall away behind me. The trees grew thinner, their gnarled branches giving way to open fields bathed in the soft light of dusk. The hum in the air faded gradually, replaced by the distant sound of the world I had almost forgotten. Wind rustling through grass, the faint chirp of crickets. I tried to focus on the road to convince myself that I was safe, but my mind kept drifting back to the forest. The symbols, the whispers, the entities, they felt like more than just memories. They felt like they had left a mark on me, something I couldn't see but could feel deep in my bones. I reached a small gas station just off the highway, its fluorescent lights flickering in the growing darkness. I pulled into the lot, the car's tires crunching on the gravel, and parked near the pumps. The station was empty, the building's windows glowing faintly with the light inside. I stepped out of the car, my legs trembling, and walked toward the door. The bell above the entrance jingled as I stepped inside, the sound jarring in the stillness. The clerk behind the counter barely glanced at me as I approached. "Need help?" he asked, his voice disinterested. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words caught in my throat. How could I explain what I had just experienced? "I just need a phone charger," I finally said, my voice hoarse. He nodded, gesturing toward a small rack of electronics near the counter. I grabbed one quickly, fumbling with the packaging as I walked back to the car. Sitting in the driver's seat, I plugged the charger into the car's outlet and connected my phone. The screen lit up, the familiar glow of the home screen, almost comforting. I checked the time. It was much later than I had expected. Hours had passed, but it felt like I had been in the forest for days. I opened the Notes app on my phone, my fingers trembling as I tried to write down everything I could remember. The symbols, the whispers, the entities. I needed to document it all before the details slipped away. But as I typed, something strange happened. The text on the screen began to shift, the words rearranging themselves into a single sentence. "The forest remembers you." I froze, my heart pounding, as the phone screen flickered and went dark. The hum returned, faint but unmistakable, vibrating through the car. I turned the key in the ignition, the engine roaring to life, and pulled out of the gas station lot. The road stretched ahead of me, bathed in the soft glow of the car's headlights. I didn't know if the forest had truly let me go, or if it was still watching, waiting for the right moment to pull me back. All I knew was that I couldn't stop driving. The forest wasn't just alive, it was eternal. And I was part of it now, whether I wanted to be or not. The hum faded as I drove further from the forest, leaving me alone with the sound of the car's tires on the cracked pavement. The air felt lighter now, the oppressive weight of the forest no longer pressing against me. I couldn't shake the lingering unease. My thoughts raced as I replayed everything that had happened, the whispers, the symbols, the entities. It didn't feel real. and yet every detail was burned into my mind. I reached the highway and merged onto the open road, the faint glow of distant city lights on the horizon offering a sense of normalcy. The radio crackled faintly, static filling the silence, until I found a station playing soft, unassuming music. It was a small comfort, but I clung to it, desperate for anything that felt grounded. I glanced at my phone, now resting on the passenger seat, the screen dark but fully charged. I debated turning it on again, but the memory of the message, "The forest remembers you," made my stomach turn. I didn't want to risk seeing anything else. The highway stretched ahead, empty except for the occasional flicker of headlights in the distance. I kept my eyes on the road, trying to focus on the present, but my mind kept drifting back to the forest. The way it had felt alive, aware, as though it had a will of its own. I couldn't stop wondering why it had let me go. When I finally reached my apartment, the weight of exhaustion hit me all at once. The familiarity of my surroundings, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the faint glow of the streetlights outside my window should have been comforting. But instead, they felt foreign, like I didn't belong here anymore. I locked the door behind me, double-checking the deadbolt before collapsing onto the couch. My body ached, my muscles heavy with fatigue, but sleep felt impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the symbols glowing in the dark, the hollow eyes of the entities watching me. I grabbed my notebook from the coffee table, one I kept for journaling, and began writing down everything I could remember. I sketched the symbols, described the whispers, and detailed the strange energy that had radiated from the forest. The act of writing helped ground me, but it also made everything feel more real. As I finished the last page, I noticed something strange. The symbols I had sketched seemed to glow faintly under the light of my desk lamp. I blinked, leaning closer, but the glow faded, leaving only the inked lines. A chill ran down my spine. The forest might have let me go, but it hadn't left me entirely. Days passed, and life began to feel normal again. I went to work, ran errands, and tried to immerse myself in the mundane routines of daily life. But the memory of the forest lingered, a shadow that I couldn't escape. I started having dreams, vivid, unsettling visions of the forest. In the dreams, I was always back in the clearing, standing before the pedestal. The symbols on the stones glowed brighter than ever, their light pulsing in time with my heartbeat. The whispers returned, but they weren't menacing anymore. They were curious, almost inviting. "Come back. The heart beats for you. You are one of us." I woke from those dreams drenched in sweat, my chest tight with a fear I couldn't explain. The forest had left its mark on me, not just physically, but mentally, emotionally. It wasn't just a place I had visited. It was part of me now, woven into the fabric of my existence. I avoided my phone for days, afraid of seeing another message, another sign that the forest hadn't let go. But when I finally turned it on, everything seemed normal. No cryptic messages, no glitches, just the usual notifications and emails. For a moment, I allowed myself to hope that it was over. But the signs started small. The metallic scent returned occasionally, faint but unmistakable, lingering in the air even when I wasn't near the woods. Shadows in my apartment stretched longer than they should have, flickering like the ones in the forest. I began to hear whispers in the quiet moments, faint and indistinct, just at the edge of my perception. They were always the same, gentle, persistent, and filled with an eerie familiarity. The heart remembers. The forest grows. It's not over. I tried to ignore them, to convince myself it was all in my head, but the signs became harder to dismiss. One morning, I woke to find a small symbol etched into the condensation on my bathroom mirror. It was one I recognized immediately, a spiral surrounded by jagged lines, just like the carvings in the forest. My hands trembled as I wiped the mirror clean, but the sense of unease didn't leave. The forest hadn't forgotten me, and it was reminding me that I couldn't forget it either. I don't know what the forest wants from me or why it let me leave. Maybe it was satisfied with the offering, or maybe it's waiting for me to return to give it something more. But one thing is certain, the forest is alive. It sees, it remembers, and it never truly lets go. I still hear the whispers, sometimes soft and distant, calling my name. I tell myself I'll never go back, but deep down, I know the truth. The forest isn't done with me yet.